What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a conversation really about the release dates around Baldur's Gate 3 as well as Starfield. Because with both August and September shaping up to potentially be the busiest months for video games in this entire year so far, the biggest titles within that time frame I would say are these two games. But the thing is, they are very close together and they are both large RPGs. And when you add the fact that an edition of Starfield will actually give people early access to it on potentially September 1st, things get that much more cloudy. The reason I'm talking about this is because I've previously discussed how Baldur's Gate 3 and how its launch goes is important for that genre, because beyond that, ultimately, these are just two games that are releasing, and while it makes my schedule personally very busy, as I imagine many others who would like to play both, it's not really that big of a deal otherwise. However, I do think it does have potential implications, because between these two, if people had to choose, my money would be on Starfield, because as somebody who loves CRPGs, which is what Baldur's Gate 3 is, I also know that comparatively to other genres of video games, it's a bit of a niche topic. And within that niche, Baldur's Gate 3 is pretty, I would say, unique. As I mentioned, I've talked about this previously. I made a video about how the sheer amount of resources being poured into Baldur's Gate 3 is remarkable in its size and scope. CRPGs typically don't get that much attention and are usually at best AA projects these days. And because of that, I think a lot of companies have their eyes on how Baldur's Gate 3 ultimately performs. But naturally, it gets a little cloudier than that even, simply because BG3 launched into early access several years ago when it reportedly sold millions of copies, and that's in addition to whatever it actually sells on release day or thereabout. And because we can only estimate things like cost versus profit actually made, it's hard to say what Larian or Wizards of the Coast here with the D&D license is going to consider successful. And when you put all of that sort of uncertainty right next to the biggest launch of the year potentially, one of the largest at the very least, I think you've got a recipe for a game being potentially overshadowed. And like I already mentioned, between the two, I would bet Starfield wins that scenario. But at the same time, I really sincerely doubt that the release date for Baldur's Gate 3 will get delayed. It's already been in early access for a very long time. And while I think moving Baldur's Gate 3's release date to potentially later in the year, either November or December, makes a certain amount of sense, you also have to balance that against upsetting a lot of people who are already banking on that one's release date as well. And then there's simply the public perception of a lack of faith, so to speak, in your product if you're moving it purely to get out of the way of another release date, especially for what is ultimately a different subgenre of game. All to say that, again, I just don't think they're going to move the release date, though I do acknowledge the possibility. Now, for me, as both a reviewer and a fan, I would say Baldur's Gate 3 wins this for me. It is both releasing a little bit early, and it's my own favorite genre, plus it's kind of the cornerstone of what this channel is about, that is to say CRPGs, and given how almost everyone will be talking about Starfield for sure, it makes a lot more sense for me to focus on the thing I specialize in, and truth be told, want to play a little bit more, with Baldur's Gate 3. Now, honestly, that's a whole lot of words to say two games are releasing real close to each other and it's going to be hard for me to play both. And realistically, if that's my biggest problem in life, things are going very well. The main thing I will be keeping an eye on here, though, is that the specifics of how this plays out, as well as the sales numbers and whether or not this was a success, or if we even get all of that information publicly, will likely inform how these projects are handled in the future, both by Larian as well as the industry at large, because if a project with the sheer amount of resources that Baldur's Gate 3 has on top of the sheer brand recognition of it manages to flop, I just don't see a lot of AAA versions of these types of games being attempted anymore, and then the ramifications of that have their own separate conversation about whether or not that's a good or bad thing, though I certainly don't think the genre is going anywhere, as the simple fact that this channel exists proves that that audience is there, and there's a lot of passionate developers out there that will make these types of games regardless, but it does nonetheless provide an interesting viewpoint on exactly how this situation resolves itself, because for many, I imagine this will be a bit of a tough choice. As for me, I plan on thoroughly playing and reviewing both, but it is almost certainly going to take me quite some time, likely hundreds of hours for each one, and to give a bit of a frame of reference for that, the last big CRPG that launched was Wrath of the Righteous, I would say, and that one took me like 2 months to 100%, and that was with tons of experience with the beta and everything. It's an immense game, and I imagine Baldur's Gate 3 will be much of the same, and that's to say nothing of Starfield and its 1,000 planets, let alone to broach the subject of the other games releasing around that time period. But all of that to say I'm really excited for August and September, as I think they are going to be packed for games, including some of my most anticipated stuff. So, I hope you enjoyed this video. By all means, let me know what you think about all this down in the comment section below. I'm curious how everyone else is feeling about the situation, or if there's anything in particular launching around that time besides these two titles that you'd like to enjoy. But regardless of all that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.